to have Amanda join us. We'll start off with some introductions. So my name is Noah Warder. I'm head of people over here at Gusto. Really excited to have Amanda join us. I've known Amanda for a few years now. She's helped me a lot, making our recruitment better and my personal growth. Always a good person to talk to about recruitment and candidate experience and all that great stuff. So I'm really excited to have her today to kind of like give us the lowdown and trade and share some of her trade secrets on candidate experience and recruitment. And so thanks again, Amanda, for joining us. I know you're really busy. Your company's taken off. So thanks for giving us some of your time.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And back at Noah and I have known each other for 5 years since we were on, since we talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion, a small round table with like donuts and pastries like at 7:30 on a Thursday morning.
You can still do that.
Yeah, super important. And then, no, you've been super helpful. My last company we opened up, we call it our first second office in Toronto. And Noah has been super helpful to just understand the Canadian landscape and just how to do important things like recruiting internationally. So very excited to be here today. My name is Amanda. I'm the head of talent at Retool. The 10-second pitch is that Retool is a fast way of building internal tools. Before Retool, I led talent over at Lever, the applicant tracking software. I was there for about 4.5 years. And before that was at a really big company called Microsoft. So consistently winnowed my way down in terms of company size. And I think I found my home in smaller companies. So very excited to connect today. And so today we're going to be focusing quite a bit on, like Noah mentioned, candidate experience, but also I think defining like what is candidate experience and when does candidate experience end? And then we'll talk actually about some tactical things that you can do around candidate experience. One of my pet peeves is when I come to a webinar and I'm busy, but so are all of you, but like it's all very theoretical or it's the 30,000 foot view. And so we're not going to do that today. Instead, we're going to talk about some tactical things that depending on where you and your company or organization is at, you can take that to hopefully apply either some of the thoughtfulness around candidate experience or just shamelessly borrow some of the things that we're doing. I'm a big believer in that recruiting, candidate experience, human resources, onboarding really should be way more open source than it is today. And that's how Noah and I got to meet and engage. So we'll go ahead and talk first about candidate experience in general, and then we'll actually talk about the extension of candidate experience through the lens of onboarding. And then, if I recall correctly, we also want to leave about 10 or so minutes for questions at the end, correct?
Yeah, correct. And so if you have questions, like throw them into the Q&A, add them into chat, and we'll be answering them sort of as we go, but probably most of it will happen at the end of the session. And we've got a few questions that people submitted when they registered as well. We'll get to those. And I also want to mention that Amanda set up a nice little resource list for us to share at the end. And so everyone who's here and anyone who signed up, you'll get a recording of this session, plus the list of recommendations and resources that Amanda's kind of put together for everybody. So look out for that after the fact. So pretty excited. Not only we get to get away with some great tips and tricks and resources, but we'll also get a nice rundown of everything that was talked about today for everyone to share. But I do recommend taking some good notes because there's going to be some nuggets that you don't want to lose.
Thanks, Noah. Excellent. Well, let's go ahead and get started. So first to frame candidate experience, I think candidate experience can often feel so daunting. And the fact that we even have 73 total people here today shows that it's really valuable, but it's also really tough to know where to start. And so I totally appreciate that we probably have a number of people listening today. They're the person. There is no other person. They're the person that does onboarding, recruiting, they do candidate experience. Maybe you do some HR, or you may be on a much more well-staffed or more well-resourced team, which is great. But I think regardless of the size and stage of your team, there's this pressing feeling in all the things that we do of there's so much to do and there's not enough time. And I think oftentimes the softer parts of recruiting can often get pushed to the back burner. And I think that there are some very low lift things that we can do as people in this space to really continue to push candidate experience to the front. And the reason we're here to talk about, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I'm just going to jump in really quickly. We're going to launch a quick poll of saying, what does your talent team look like? And so just as Amanda's continuing to jump into things, just fill it out and let us know kind of what does your team look like? So let us know. And then we can get a better understanding of who we're talking to here.
Excellent. Thank you, Noah. I can't actually vote as a panelist. I wanted to participate. So please do fill out the poll. Thank you, Noah. And so we'll get a sense of you and your team, or maybe you and you. And so I think with candidate experience, it's so often just to ignore because you have so many other things that are pulling your attention. But the reason candidate experience, one of the reasons, is that it's so important is it can really help differentiate your company. I just read a report, that I'll need to send over to Noah as well. I just read this yesterday that candidates on average get about 2.7 offers today. The time to hire, so the interview process is about 35% faster than it was this time last year. And counter offers are up by about 22% as well. So wow. All told, like I just threw a lot of numbers at you, but all told, the candidate landscape, the talent marketplace is just zooming ahead, right? So that differentiation is really important. And then two, candidate experience is a great leading indicator of what an employee or prospective employee can actually expect once they're internal at your company. And so really taking candidate experience seriously, I think can be a huge boon. And I know that the survey just ended. Noah, do you want to jump in and let people know what our audience looks like?
Yeah, and so it's pretty even. Like we're looking at like roughly 30% in each category, but it looks like the most people actually do have a whole team dedicated to talent acquisition. So kudos to you.
Okay, sorry, no, you're the odd person out. It's just you.
I'm falling in that just myself bucket, which is about 32%, and then the other 27% have like one person that's dedicated. So they have a talent acquisition specialist who's kind of doing it all. So yeah.
Okay, and for Jenny, it's just her and her director. Kudos, Jenny, it's hard work. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for sharing, everybody. That's super helpful for us, really appreciate it. So now we'll go ahead and kind of get into the content. I don't know, I imagine for many of you, maybe not all of you, we've been working distributedly. And I think that this has put an extra squeeze on candidate experience. And so for us at Retool, we have also had to adapt our candidate experience. We're not planning on returning to the office until later in the fall. Many companies in the US are not choosing to return until 2022. And some of you are like, I never left the office. So I know it's a mixed bag, but Noah, for you over at Gusto, how have you all been adapting your candidate experience as it's been distributed this year?
Yeah. And so we're kind of falling into the, like, we've decided to just embrace that remote lifestyle, and we're going that way. We'll have the office as like a collaboration space, but that's it. Like no one's expected to go in there. If someone wants to use it, that's it. And so like when I joined the company, we had nothing. We had spreadsheets and Google Docs and all that good stuff. And so the biggest things that we've done is just try and put in those frameworks, build that foundation, and really try and give a consistent experience across all candidates, and sort of set in like those questionnaires and those scorecards and make sure that people are asking the same questions and really trying to reduce that bias. And then specifically the candidates is just over communicating. Like let's touch base with them as much as possible, and make sure that they understand where they are every step of the way. And it's not perfect, and we've definitely dropped the ball on some candidates, and because not everything's it's all taped together with duct tape and wire, and sometimes things fall through the cracks, unfortunately. But we are trying to do our best and getting better. And I'm also going to just launch our second poll, which is like, what are you all doing for your candidate experience right now? Like, are you doing anything? Are you doing some things but you're not really tracking it, or are you kind of like really at the top of your game tracking everything? And so let us know in the next poll as well.
Awesome, thanks, Noah. And so one thing I do want to point out, even before we get into like all the things you can do around candidate experience, is sometimes candidate experience in this big old bucket is exactly what Noah is talking about. Like that's the work. It's foundational, right? And so I think it can be really tempting to look at other companies and like they're doing really flashy things, or there are these huge initiatives that are going to take a lot of, Haley, I see your question. Thank you. Or it's going to take a lot of heavy lifting to actually get ahead of an initiative. And so before we dive in, actually, Haley, thank you so much for asking, like, what does candidate experience mean? I think of candidate experience as two things. So one, there's just like the outcome of how does a candidate feel once they exit your process? And what has their experience been, right? Did they go through an overly sanitized process where they were not treated as like a holistic human being? Sometimes that happens. Or do you feel like you were able to really get to know them holistically? You felt like you were able to understand their motivations. You feel like that you were, like Noah talked about, you over communicated about expectations in the process. It's the complete experience that they go through as they interview and then start with your company, hopefully. And so some of these things can fit into, like, I think about it kind of like a report card. Like, what kind of grade would your candidate give you? Some companies send out candidate experience surveys. Sometimes we just ask our candidates as recruiters. We also send anonymous surveys as well. But it's the experience they go through, and they should be able to answer this question very quickly, for example. So to give you a very easy heuristic, would you recommend a friend or a family member to go through an interview process at this company? And if the answer is yes, great. Why? If the answer is no, much more interesting. Let's dig into that as well. All right. Great, Kaylee. Thank you very much. All right. I know you want to share these results.
Yeah. So it seems like definitely like large majority of people are doing something, but they're not really tracking it. So it's on people's radar. They know that it's important. They're doing some things, but they're not collecting that data and the metrics behind it, which is like full on good start. That's where a lot of us are now. How do we like move on to that next step?
Exactly. So that's thank you for the segue. It's a really nice leg up into what we'll talk about next. So first, I encourage you to think about what your goals are around candidate experience. And like Noah mentioned, it might just be that you just need to lay that foundation. And so if you really just need to build a repeatable interview process, that is a huge part of candidate experience. Like when we think about a repeatable recruiting process, so just to make it very straightforward, like a recruiter phone screen, and then they talk with 3 people internally, then they move to a final conversation with a CEO or hiring manager, and then offer, right? Well, are you doing that consistently for every candidate? And if not, why? And sometimes there are good reasons, but even within that process, really being able to articulate, are we extending the same kind of evaluation to every candidate? Part of this is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Part of this is also just making sure that you're running a really tight process. And then for you, the practitioner, you're also not put into this place of every time I have a new candidate, I have to design a new process. I've definitely been in that position. It can be really, really taxing. So it's important to understand what your goals are around candidate experience, because it can be tempting to feel like you have to do everything, but it's also not realistic. So think about, ideally, how do you want your candidate to exit your process? How do you want him or her to feel? And then next, really be ruthless about articulating what kind of bandwidth do you have, right? It sounds like most of us have at least another person or a few people that can shoulder this burden. That's great. I've been on talent teams before that had like 50 people or a couple hundred people. I've also been on talent teams where I've started as the first person. So be really upfront about like what you can and can't do. And Noah, a follow-up question for you, like at Gusto, like what are some things that you were like, that would be awesome to tackle? Now is not the right moment, and I've had to say no to it.
Candidate surveys. I would love to be having candidates fill out surveys. It's just not a practical thing to do. We would have to do it through like Google Forms and be very manual and having to get all that in there. We can automate some of it with like template emails, but then digging through that data and starting to pull out like things that we can action on is also just a whole other project that would have to go through. So it's like you said, like the main things for me were like step in, build the foundation, build a process that works consistently, and then refine it a little bit through a couple of cycles. And then like, okay, now how can we start building on top of this whole process?
Exactly. Yes. I think that it's hard to do, right? Because I think that we all have this idea of like what our own ideal future state looks like. It can feel really crappy if you're like, I can see it, but I know it's just not reasonable to think that we're going to get there. And that's okay. Part of that is just like the ruthless prioritization. It's really hard, but I think when we really scope what our expected outcomes are or what our goals are and how we can work towards that, it doesn't set us up for either failure or disappointment. And it creates a lot of clarity for our candidates, but also if you have internal stakeholders, just being really clear about like what we are and what we aren't going to focus on. I know I mentioned, or I remember last time we chatted, one thing that has been really impactful for Gusto is just the level of communication. Do you want to talk a little bit about how communication and closing the loop with candidates has played out for Gusto?
Yeah. And so like we chatted about when we went through our dry run of like, making sure that candidate gets that touch point. Like as soon as their resume comes in, they get an email saying, hey, thanks for your application. We'll get back to you as soon as we can. we think it's really important that everyone understands where they are at in the process. Just like that, like it's amazing how many, I mean, we talked about this, like when I was looking for my next role, how many times I didn't even get an email saying that they got my application. And then just giving them updates and doing the like, you know, thanks for the conversation. I'll get back to you by this date with next steps. And then even if you don't have those next steps set, like what we were saying before, of like, give them like, I like what you called it, the no update of just like, hey, I don't really have anything to update you on, but I'm still working towards it. I'll hopefully like be able to get you the firm deadline, like the firm date for your next conversation by this date. Just so that they know that we're continuing to talk to them and make them know that like we're still thinking about them as candidates and that they're moving through the process and they're not just like a drop in the bucket to us.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like that communication coming from that place of like, there's another human on the other end of a process, and not just thinking about this is a rec I need to close, but really remembering that there is a person going through what could be a very big life shift, right? Like looking for a new job, entering a new company. So a few things that we do in our process, so getting down to like the actual brass tacks. No, I love like the no update. I think it also brings a little bit of vulnerability to recruiting as well. Like, hey, I'm the recruiter still working on getting you that update. I just want you to know that I haven't forgotten about you. To me, this really falls into that bucket of candidate experience. I think it can really be easy to be like, well, I don't have anything to let my candidate know that there's been an update. Why would I clog her inbox? But you have to remember the mental load on that candidate of like, what's this company doing? What are they thinking about me? Am I lost in the ether? And they feel like if they don't have that person internally advocating for them, or even just being a tour guide for them throughout this whole process, it can feel very isolating, and it can also just damage the perception that a candidate has about your company. So some things that we've done at Retool, and to give you a sense of the size of my team, I have 2 technical recruiters, and then I have 1 person that's in a hybridized role, so half recruiting coordinator, so back of the house logistics, coordination, et cetera, but then half really dedicated to candidate experience. In fact, their title is called Candidate Experience Specialist. And so some of the things that we've implemented as we've built a lot of our foundational work and we're ready for that next step, we give every candidate an on-site guide. Obviously, people are not coming on site for us right now, so these are remote on-site guides, but it's a compiled structure of what their whole day with us will look like. And depending on the role, that could be 3 hours for more technical interviews or technical roles. That could be 6 hours. But we give them a very detailed schedule. We tell them who their interviewer is. We give them a LinkedIn link. We also tell them the focus area of the interview. And if you're thinking like, oh, but I don't know the focus area of each interview, fantastic. That's a great thing to identify. This is where I think this plays back into building that repeatable process. But the reason I think focusing on focus areas and highlighting that for candidates is so important is not that you're telling a candidate, here are the answers to the questions your interviewer is going to ask, but instead it helps them understand what's the stage for this interview? Who is my audience? How should I start thinking about this context, right? And for me, that just helps people understand what we're looking for. They still have to, be able to talk about their past experiences, their decision-making. And so I always find it very confusing when recruiters are like, I don't want to tell them focus areas. To me, that's just not setting our candidates up for success. And then the third thing that we do in those on-site guides is we provide some fun facts about our interviewers. 95% of the time, it does not come up in interviews, but what it does do is it brings more of that humanity back to the process, right? Like even now we're like Noah and I, like we're good buddies. We've known each other for 5 years, but we're doing all of this via screens, right? And we're lucky in that we have this relationship, but for somebody that you're, meeting for the first time here, it's just tougher to build rapport. And so these fun facts are meant to remind your candidate there's a human on the other side of this as well. And we want you to be successful. And I think my 3 fun facts are ask me about why I joined Retool. I want to talk about dogs, my dog, your dog, any dog. And then 3, I'm a big fan of the TV show, The Office. Like you throw a quote my way, I can probably quote the next line back to you. Do candidates ask me about it? Not really, but instead of it being, I'm talking to the scary head of talent, Amanda, it's like, oh, Amanda loves dogs. I also love dogs. Like, that's cool. And so we bring a little bit more of that humanity into the process, even if it's something that we never talk about. The second thing that we focus on is the same level of prep for each candidate. This is higher lift, so I do want to call this out. So I think sometimes we respond to candidates that are a little bit noisier. So for example, I have candidates in the sales realm that are like, hey, can you give me a little bit more detail about what I'm going to talk about with Paul, your head of sales? Right. And so for us, what we want to do is make sure that we're providing the same altitude, the same level of preparation for candidates. So it's not just the candidates that are proactively asking, now they're better prepped, right? But maybe candidates that are a little bit more reserved, or they don't know that they can even ask, they're not getting that same level of prep. So one way to combat this, we also built out a technical interview guide. And so this is for our software engineers or other folks that'll be contributing meaningfully to our code base. We go through each interview and help them understand, like, do you need to have your dev environment set up? Does it matter which language you're programming in? What are we going to be evaluating, and how are we going to be evaluating this? It did take us a good 8 weeks to put together. So this is where that realistic opportunity, realistic resources that I have available, do take a hard look at that. But this is how we really try to tackle that perspective of, is everybody getting the same level of prep? And so for us, we have a template email that goes out that has this technical interview guide attached. And then the on-site guides we have turned into templates. And so creating a new on-site guide takes about 2 minutes now. So we're not starting from scratch. We have the formatting baked. It looks good. Candidates love it. And then a third thing that we do is that we also build in some diversity, equity, and inclusion in very small ways in some of the things that we do as well. So for example, we ask for correct pronouns pre-remote onsite. And so we ask at that point because it's not so early in the process where somebody may not be comfortable sharing information like that with us, but we also want to honor that not everybody presents as they identify, right? And so I would say about 85 to 90% of candidates respond as well. So I think it also helps give a nod to how we view diversity, equity, and inclusion as well. So these are a handful of things that we're able to do. Again, I have a whole human dedicated to doing a lot of these things. I remember doing this before our candidate experience specialist joined. Y'all, it was a lot. It was a lot to do. And so that's where I had to have some of the hard conversations, Noah, that I imagine you had with yourself around, like, what can I actually do? And then what can I just have to be real with internal stakeholders and candidates that I can't, that I'll have to siphon away. And then +1 to the no update. It's from my perspective, it's the freest, easiest thing a recruiter can do to build trust and build a really positive perspective from that candidate. So, I mean, I sent one of these emails last night. I was struggling to get an update internally. I was like, hey, so-and-so, just to let you know, I'm still tracking things down internally. I expect to have an update for you by end of day tomorrow, but even if I don't, you'll still hear from me. And then it's about making good on that. And so I think, Noah, like you mentioned, I've definitely dropped the ball. My team has, like, it sucks. No one likes to do that. So any mechanisms you can build to make sure that, you're delay sending that email if you don't have that update, or you put a reminder on your calendar. These are all things that contribute to candidate experience. So those are a couple of things that we've built. And a lot of these things are going to endure past COVID. Once we return back to the office, we're still going to send these remote, these on-site guides. But then the day of, we're going to print it out and make sure that somebody has it as something to physically hold on to when they do come back to the office.
I love it. I love the, bringing the humanity back to recruitment and job hunting. And it's like you said, it's one of the most, it's a very stressful thing to do as a candidate, to put yourself out there. You're interviewing, but we've always talked about this internally, is candidates are interviewing us as well. This is a 50-50. We're not just interviewing them, especially for those senior, hard to fill positions where, like you said, they've probably got at least 2 other offers on the table, and they're talking to other companies. They're interviewing us as much as we're interviewing them. So we need to be putting our best foot forward as well.
Exactly. And that reminds me, another second free, very easy to do thing as well is take a look at the structure of your interviews, right? So are they 30 minutes, 45 minutes, 60 minutes? Doesn't really matter. But a decent chunk of that time should be reserved for candidate questions. And I find that especially with less experienced interviewers or without enough guidance, it can be really tempting as an interviewer to be like, cool, I have 30 minutes. Those are my 30 minutes to ask questions, and the candidate talks.
For a 30-minute interview, I recommend holding at least 5 minutes. And then the phrase that I use to let my candidate know that like, hey, I'm done asking questions, like, Noah, thank you so much for answering all of these questions. I really appreciate it. I also believe that interviews should be two ways. So I want to pass the baton to you and turn the table. So what kind of questions do you have for me? What can I answer? For longer interviews, maybe 5 to 10 minutes. But the goal is, I think, Noah, just like you mentioned, to provide that opportunity and that reminder for the candidate, like, oh, right, this is a two-way street. What do I want to know? What would get in the way of me being able to positively move forward? And then the next thing that we'll talk about, because I know that we want to leave time for questions here, is the continuation of candidate experience into the onboarding process. I've been fortunate in past companies to actually have like a people team or an HR team that, you pass the baton, like we're talking about, and you're like, cool, go forth and onboard my new hire. Or you might be looking in the mirror and that's you, right, Noah? Like, you are the onboarding champion, right, at Gusto?
Person as well, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So, for you at Gusto, like, what does that transition from cool, candidate has signed their contract, we're good to go, and now what does it mean for them to move over to the onboarding part of the candidate experience journey?
Yeah, and so we've sort of like, we're still hashing this out for sure, and it's a work in progress. I actually just met with a bunch of new hires and got a bunch of feedback on our onboarding process. And so I got a bunch of new changes that I can implement to make things even better. So I'm very excited for that. But what we do is generally, like, once they've signed that employment agreement, everything's hunky-dory, we're like, great. And depending on the length of time of when they're joining, like if it's like they're coming in 2 weeks, and then it's like pretty easy, like, great, I'll check in with you next week. I'll give you updates. You'll start getting invitations to like your company email. Within that company email, you get invitations for all of the softwares. And the biggest one is like Slack and Asana. We use Asana for all of our project management. And then in Asana, they get invited to their own onboarding sort of project. And in there, there's tasks with descriptions and guides on everything that they need to do, but all of the things that other people are doing for them as well. So like, send your headshot to a designer so that they can get it on our about page. And there's a task for a designer, like, put so-and-so on the about page, and then like talk to our payroll specialist to get on payroll, and like our payroll specialist has a task to like call so-and-so and like get their information and do it over the phone so the numbers aren't being written anywhere, and like and so it just lays everything out nicely, and then the managers are in there communicating with the candidate as well, and so it just lays everything out in a nice checklist with due dates on things, and gives them that sort of expectations of like what's happening over the next 2 weeks. And then with those emails of like, and then the before their first day, the manager will also send an email being like, hey, come into the office, come into the office around 9:30, 10, start a little bit later. First day is always really hectic. We'll kick things off with a meeting with myself and probably Noah. And then we'll have you join like the all team meeting, and then we'll kind of go from there and start introducing you to people in other departments. So laying out those expectations in the first week and giving them like a very practical guide that they can check things off and feel good about doing things like, oh, I did that. I can check that thing off.
I was productive on my first day.
Exactly. Like,
awesome. Thank you. And I mean, so much, I think, Noah, what you're saying, like, to me, goes back to what we're talking about with overall candidate experience. We have a checklist. We have an interview checklist. We have a pre-onboarding checklist. And so I think that this is reflected in onboarding of what we just talked about with candidate experience, right? Like, what do you want somebody's experience to be? And it sounds like, Noah, you want to avoid any sort of confusion or lack of understanding who's owning what, where do I go to for what? So it's like clarity, right? So the goal is clarity, and then knowing what your bandwidth is. Cool, we're going to use Asana. This is going to be a tool that sets us up for success. And then it's just about expectation setting, kind of like we've talked about with candidate experience as well. And so for folks that are listening, you might be like, this sounds very familiar. Yes, part of it is project management, but it's also about understanding what you can and can't do, right? Just due to your own limitations. And so if you're thinking, I don't think I can get budget for Asana, that's cool. Create a checklist for yourself. Like for us, we do a big old guidebook for candidates. It took a while to write. It's 18 pages and covers a lot of the things, Noah, that you mentioned. Who do I go to for what? How do I get access to that thing? Where's payroll information and so forth. But for us, it was worth the upfront cost because now every employee uses this and references this, right? And so I mentioned at the top of our conversation that sometimes we feel like we're running this marathon and then we get this candidate to the finish line of accepting their offer. And then it's kind of like we almost disengage. We're like, well, they accepted their offer. Like, what more do you want from me? And I think it's so important to have this continuation of candidate experience through the onboarding experience, right? Because you've basically just advertised to your candidate, this is what you can expect from us as a company. And now if all of a sudden you pull the plug and they're kind of left high and dry, not knowing what the next steps are, or knowing who to go to for what, it almost creates this lack of mistrust, right? And so even if you don't have a ton of bandwidth, even just telling your candidate, it's almost like a no update of like, hey, we're still a small company, but here's what you can expect from me. In the next week, I'm going to send you your first day email with, timing, resources, et cetera, is super, super important. And so for us, one of the things that we've done is we've almost done exactly what you have. We have this guidebook, but then we also have, depending on the team, a 4 to 6 week ramp plan. It's also templatized, and it has themes, and then it has exactly what Noah mentioned around like, you should plan on meeting with this person. This invite is already on your calendar. Basically telling the new hire, no action needed. Or it might say like, here are 5 people you should meet with cross-functionally. Go forth and schedule it yourself, right? So just being really clear about those expectations. But even just giving somebody a brief infrastructure or a broad overview rather of what they can expect can just help that employee transition from candidate to new hire, and also just set the expectation of the environment that they're stepping into, right? And it's totally okay if you don't have owners for a lot of these things. It's much more important just to be proactive about that degree of communication. And the last thing I'll leave you with before we turn this over to questions, and Jenny, thank you for your question, is why investing in onboarding is so important. Yeah, we've talked about candidate experience. It should reflect the candidate journey. It should reflect your employer brand, et cetera, et cetera. But for folks that have good onboarding experiences, meaning they have been onboarded in an intentional way, there's been some thought, they understand expectations, they know who to go to. Studies have shown that generally they have longer tenure with the company, and they frankly just achieve more success. These are very vague terms that I'm sharing, and I'll send you a link later. But what that means is if we help people be successful in those first early weeks, and that might be just pointing them in the right direction or connecting them with the right person, their odds are they'll do better at your company, which is what you want, right? So investing in onboarding, and as opposed to they've started, they're no longer my problem, which I think a lot of companies do. It is an extension of our jobs. I see that. And of course, as your company grows or you grow your team and there will be more of a niche person owning that, great, but you might not be there yet. So I still think if there's any sort of bandwidth you can reserve from that bucket of candidate experience, I do encourage you to focus on onboarding. So I'm going to stop talking because I know that we see some questions here. No, I'm going to pass it over to you to manage questions, and I'm going to mute myself to cough really quickly.
Cool, great. So let's get to Jenny's question right away, and then we have a couple of questions that people submitted when they're registering. But if you have questions, throw them in the Q&A so we can start answering them and get those perspectives. And so Jenny's first question: so do you have any recommendations for recruiting, onboarding internationally across time zones?
Yes, great question. If you're onboarding one employee across a different time zone, I just try to be very conscious about time zones, right? So for example, 9 a.m. on a Monday for our new hire in India, it's like 9:30 p.m. for them in New Delhi. Probably not the best time to do onboarding. And so I do my best to meet them in the middle and just be very conscious of time zones. If we have a group, I really try to keep it to creating community, right? And so if we can onboard them with our San Francisco hires, cool, that's probably easier on my schedule. But knowing if we have remote hires, which for us, we have about 95% of our total employee base, they're going to be in San Francisco, right? But those other 5%, we really don't want them to feel like second-class citizens or that they chose incorrectly by not being at headquarters. So investing in creating a little bit of community and hosting a singular onboarding session with them and helping them understand that if there's resources or if there's a budget for them to do some things as an onboarding cohort, it helps solidify that identity for them. And we've been pretty successful with that. For example, we do cross-functional weekly lunches, and we have a cohort of just our remote employees. So that way somebody in New York is like, yeah, I'll eat lunch with you, San Francisco, at like 1 p.m., but it's like closer to my dinner time over here. So if you can really originate from time zone and then community building, it tends to have better outcomes.
Cool. Great. Love it. Yeah, it's one of those things that like, you just have to be really conscious of where people are. And like, we've got some people out in Toronto. Most of us are based in Victoria, Vancouver. And so a lot of that is like, yeah, again, like, okay, we'll start earlier. We'll start at 8 a.m. because that's, 11 a.m. your time. So let's meet in the middle. I like that a lot.
We just moved our all hands from 4 p.m. on Thursdays to 10 a.m. on Thursdays. And so funny enough, we saw a 20% increase in attendance.
Yeah, it's those little things.
Yeah.
All right, so next one, this comes from Paula. Recommendations for a smooth process to get equipment out to remote employees and set up for their first day.
Yes, this was something that we failed miserably at early on in COVID. So I have learnings for you. Hopefully you can learn from my mistakes. So to make sure it's a smooth process for both employee and company, in the early days, it just took a lot of detail management. So for example, I set up a corporate FedEx account, and then I created templates for myself for like new hire shipment, for example. So I had everything baked in there. And then depending on where you're located and how FedEx works or what service you use, it was invaluable to me to have the corporate account so that FedEx could come to me and pick up those packages. I also spent maybe an hour on Amazon looking for boxes that would fit for us machines. We send a little bit of swag. I write a personalized card and get all of that into the box and then send that tracking number to the employee and then ask them to verify that it arrived. It is very manual, but for us, it was worth it because any sort of personal touch that we can put on this very, remote or far away, distanced experience was worth it for us. And so some nights I would just write a lot of cards and make them personalized, reference interview feedback, etc. But again, that humanity that we've been talking about throughout candidate experience, I think is helpful. Currently, what we do have, because we have the volume of hires now where we're onboarding several people per week, my candidate experience specialist on Wednesdays, he goes through our spreadsheet, our tracker of new hire dates. We ask recruiters to gather all of this information. It goes into a form, into our applicant tracking system. And then we know every Wednesday at 11, Clarence is adding people to our HRIS and then is boxing up laptops and then getting them over to new hires. So my biggest piece of advice is do it in bulk and then also track because it was very easy for me early on to almost send 2 computers to a new hire because we're being pulled in so many different directions. So I recommend creating a process, create some personal touches, and then build that process around what works for you and make it as low lift as possible.
Yeah. And we're not quite at the same level as Amanda, but what we've also done is just for the laptop part of things is like we've set up a corporate account with Apple. And so they directly ship our laptops to new employees now. So we don't even have to touch that part. And then we send like a swag package separately being like, here's your hoodie, here's the things you need for Gusto, welcome to the team. And so they'll get 2 packages, which just makes it ideal. And then we say, order your own monitor and desk setup and reimburse everything.
So we have done the same thing. We instead of reimbursing, we don't have a great reimbursement process right now. So instead, we ask people to add working from home equipment, and we bulk that as like things you would reasonably expect your company to provide. That does not include furniture because our expectation is like this monitor that I'm talking to you from returns to the office once we do as well. And then our candidate experience candidate experience specialist manages all of those things. If you have a team, my biggest piece of advice is house this under one person because they'll be doing this frequently. The more somebody does something frequently, the better they're going to be at it. And so keeping it fractured just increases the likelihood of either it not getting done or errors.
Yeah, that's good point. Let's move to Shay's question. Any recommendations on great places to source diverse candidates, post roles outside of the norm, Indeed, LinkedIn, etc.? I do a lot of outreach, and we do have a very diverse team, but when we post roles, I worry we aren't accessing enough of a broad range of applicants.
Oh, good question. I don't find postings terribly helpful. Instead, what I do is like we host ours on our actual like careers page, retool.com/careers. And I will link to a role when we're reaching out to candidates. I think that there's much more value in controlling your pipeline through sourcing as opposed to relying on inbound applicants. And so if you're trying to think like, man, I don't know where to go next, I actually wouldn't recommend that unless you have relationships that you want to start building in your community with organizations. So for example, for us, one of the organizations that I've worked with in the past is Code Tenderloin. It gets people from the generally underserved, lower socioeconomic status folks in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco going through a coding boot camp. And so instead of just posting the role there, we actually contribute, right? And then we're like, hey, cool, we're hiring. If you're interested, let us know. But also we try to help that organization. So that meaningful connection, I think, is more valuable to me for output per hour spent combing through applicants on a new posting site. And then the other thing that I've been fairly successful with, or my team has been fairly successful with, is just sourcing with groups in LinkedIn. So groups that people attend that have come from historically Black universities or colleges or Latinx at fill in, the blank university. That's been pretty fruitful for us as well. And we've been much more satisfied with those results as opposed to we have now this live posting on Indeed.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you, Amanda. And then Tess, can you provide other example questions that a candidate experience survey should have?
You bet. I can actually pull what we send to candidates, and no, I can send that over to you. So we ask like overall, it's basically like our CSAT score, right? It's like how likely are you to recommend Retool as a place to interview, right? And then we also ask about interviewer timeliness, preparation, if the candidate felt like they were adequate, if they had the adequate opportunity and time to talk about things that matter to them. With this role, this one is a little bit grain of salt because what we care about with the role might be different than what the candidate cares about with the role, but I think it's important that we're setting the stage of here's what we expect to cover. Did the candidate feel like they were able to get through the things that they wanted to as well? And then we also ask, were you able to learn things about Retool that were important to you throughout the process? The final question, and I recommend really keeping it to like 5 questions or so. Anything longer than that, we saw a drop off at Lever of just survey completion. It's just like a long, daunting survey. We tell people it should take you like 90 seconds. The final question that we get the best feedback, constructive feedback on is there anything else you'd like us to know? And so this is where if a candidate had like a weird interaction with an interviewer or an interviewer truly went above and beyond, this gives them that free space to talk about that. I do recommend making it anonymous. And I also recommend only launching candidate surveys when you have enough candidate volume where when your candidate knows like, I'm literally the only person on the recruiting team that interviewed for this role this week. I don't feel comfortable submitting feedback. So part of this is a timing component, but also telling your candidates, hey, this is an anonymous survey. And if you're doing this through Google surveys, just make sure, double, triple check that you have that button clicked, that you're not collecting emails along with the surveys.
Yeah, and put it like, when we did this at the last company that I was at, we like bolded like this is anonymous. The title said anonymous candidate survey, like just really hammering that home of like, this is anonymous feedback, so we don't know who you are.
Yes. And the last thing I would recommend is like in that little preamble of like, here's a survey, help candidates understand why you're asking. For us, like it seems very straightforward. It's not always straightforward to candidates. And keep in mind, you are asking something else of somebody who has already invested time in your interview process. And so for me, what's been helpful is framing it through the lens of we're always looking to provide an even better experience, not just for you, but for other candidates. And so let them know like we appreciate this feedback. We're going to use this feedback to inform and influence things that we decide to do moving forward.
Cool. And so I'm going to jump in and take the 2 questions that we got from people who registered early. So I just want to make sure that we answered their ones. One is about the Gusto REST API for, so not I'm not going to answer this here. If you have more questions there, I'll actually get our product team and our CS team to answer that, and then we'll send that over to you, whomever asked that. I don't have the names of who asked this there. But the other one that we have is recommendations on maintaining a positive onboarding experience online. I think we kind of went through all this already, but is there anything like you really wanted to like reinforce of like this remote experience of onboarding?
Cross-functional relationships. I think that especially while we're remote, and maybe if your company is planning on coming back to the office, this is a temporary solution. For companies that are going to be fully remote or have been remote, this could be something that is enjoying for you. But for example, at Retool, we used to eat lunch together every day. We were fortunate enough to have catered lunch. And it was great to get to know somebody in sales or somebody in marketing, and it formed some of those early relationships. And as a new hire, you're like, who are my people? How do I meet them? And it can be even more isolating now when you're like in an office by yourself. And so we have formed super casual cross-functional groups that we refresh every 8 to 12 weeks. And so I encourage you, if this is something you're interested in, to keep them small. I think the biggest ones that are still successful are maybe 7, and then tap somebody to be a host. That does not mean you have to have like an icebreaker question or anything like that, but they're responsible for kind of getting things started. And it's usually those first 5 minutes that are like, what are we going to talk about today? But then it just takes off. But it's important to allow space and time for people to form those relationships like they would if they were in the office, right? Like running into somebody in the kitchen or on the way to get a snack, or bumping into somebody, you know, on your commute. Like we don't have those things right now. So creating through an inorganic method of like these forced lunches, but to create opportunities for organic connection, that's the way that I think about it.
Cool. Yeah, it's like you said, just building those opportunities for people to actually connect, so they're not just on their laptop on Zoom.
Yeah, 100%, exactly.
I think like let's take one more question. I know we're over time, but I feel like there's a lot of questions, and any of the ones that we haven't got to live, we'll get answers to those and we'll put them in the email as well. I've got them all written down. We'll make sure that those are answered. But last one, concrete example, real step-by-step example of candidate accepting the offer letter to their first day and process happening on that first day as well. So like, and maybe this is a resource that we can send out. Maybe this is like, this might be a little bit more too detailed for the last couple of minutes of the webinar, but high level, we might have to keep it high level.
Yes, I think of it in phases, right? So you've gotten this candidate to sign their employee agreement, congrats, right? So manager, team, recruiter, cool. Then it's about setting expectations of what they can expect before they become an employee, right? So it's a very high level this week, next week, but a lot of this is variable depending on how far away this candidate's start date is, but letting them know these milestones and what they can expect from the company, even if that means you won't hear from us for 3 weeks, just setting that expectation. And then it's about, here's how we're going to get you set up for success. And so that might be equipment, like we've talked about, that might be, here's your buddy, and then letting them know very specific details on like the actual first day. What is that first day schedule? Who's their go-to person? So overall, congrats, set the expectations, and then those details should be clearer and more crisp the closer that you get to that first day. And then the first day should be generally managed by somebody else besides that new hire. So whether that's your people person, whether that's the recruiter, whether that's passing the baton to the hiring manager, but it should be very clear who is running the show for that candidate's first day.
Awesome, great. I think so. That's all the time we have for questions. I want to thank Amanda again for her time. This was really great. And thank you everyone who joined us today and taking the time to learn with us. I really hope that you found this insightful and you got some good tips and tricks, and you're going to be walking away from this webinar with some new ideas and resources. I know that like every time I talk to Amanda, I always come away with more ideas on how I can improve our whole process. And then I just wanted to like let anybody know if they're interested in learning more about Gusto and how we kind of create safe, equitable, and how with those new candidates and onboarding and that candidate recognition or employee recognition. Let us know, reach out. There's myself. There's a couple of our Gustonians in chat who you can talk to. And if you make a demo request within the next 24 hours, just mention that you are at this webinar and we can give you a nice deal on what things look like at Gusto. So you'll get the first 6 months free if you sign an annual plan with Gusto, if you kind of mention this webinar in your demo request in the next 24 hours. So let us know, reach out. we're here to help. We're here to, like, you know, everyone's remote. Let's make sure that employees have a great experience. And part of that is that onboarding and candidate experience. So thanks again, Amanda. And I'll pass it over to you for any last comments.
Everybody, you're all so busy. The work that you do is super, super important. And I know it can often feel behind the scenes, thankless, but we see it, we see you. This is such important work. And I think that whether your company knows it or not, or your employees that you're helping to hire an onboard know it or not, the work is super, super important. And the fact that you were willing to all spend about an hour with us today just demonstrates how much you care about this. So keep up the good work. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm a big fan of recruiting being much more open source than it is. So find me on LinkedIn if you have questions, if you want to go through some specific stuff, like I'm here to help. Shameless plug, I'm hiring a business recruiter and a technical recruiter in San Francisco. It does have to be on site. If you know of anybody, let me know. I'd be more than happy to chat with folks. And then if I can help you with anything, like I said, don't be shy about reaching out. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, and if for a lot of people who are asking questions about like onboarding specifically, we have another webinar coming up next month with a company called Upboard. So we're gonna have Lee, one of the co-founders there, and their whole process, their software is onboarding remotely. And so they're gonna take us through onboarding best practices, some things that you can do to make sure that's great. So we had the candidate experience with Amanda, touched a little bit on that onboarding part. With Lee, we'll go deep dive into that onboarding part. So look out for that on our webinar page. And so very excited for that as well. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great day and look out for those emails.
See you later.